welcome to the Hue Seth Show in partnership and powered by the Africa Chamber of Digital Commerce, AC of DC Inc. This podcast explores the latest trends and topics in emerging technology like blockchain, AI, and smart finance, and features insightful interviews with industry experts and thought leaders. As a driving force behind digital innovation and economic growth in Africa, AC of DC is proud to support the Hue Seth Show. Tune in to stay ahead of the curve and join us in shaping the future of technology in Africa. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Hue Seth Show. I'm your host, Hue Seth, and this episode is powered by the Africa Chamber of Digital Commerce. Today, we get to explore why Africa is a smart investment decision with Mark Kleyner. Mark is the co-founder of Dream VC, an entrepreneur ecosystem builder, and early stage investor in emerging markets. He has worked within VCs in UK, US, Europe, and Africa, and actively advises, coaches, and mentors several very early stage West and East African startups who have gone on to raise upwards of 10 million in venture financing and join programs like Google's Black Founders Fund Africa, Pioneer App, Techstars, and Y Combinator. Beyond these activities, Mark is an active startup mentor in 9+ accelerators and incubators at Startup Bootcamp, Impact Hub, Lagos, Speedstars, Founder Institute, and Village Capital. Mark is also a startup mentor with Fasters Capital and Startup Lounge Africa. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Quite an introduction to live up to.
Well, if it's the truth, that's all that matters. So I'm super stoked to have you on. And for those listening, if I sound like I have a little bit of a lisp or like my pronunciation isn't as great, that's because I have a Invisalign in, and sometimes the V and the F's and the S, it can be very tough. So if everything sounds similar, that's why I have something kind of like braces in my mouth right now. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. But again, Mark, thank you for joining us. I'm excited to dive in today.
Awesome. Excited to have that conversation.
Yeah, and if I am to reiterate, our conversation today is why Africa is a smart investment decision. So, with that being said, let's dive in. Being someone who's invested not just capital or whatnot into the ecosystem, but but really the thing that matters a lot to energy, time, right? You've invested a lot of energy, time into understanding and really learning the landscape and working with entrepreneurs. So, with that being said, what motivated you to invest in Africa, and what benefits have you witnessed so far?
Sure. I think it's a fair question, and it's definitely one that, we kind of re-ask ourselves, both myself and my co-founder, every few months, because I think the answer I give for this, whenever someone asks me that, which is actually quite common, seeing a random guy with non-African background doing business at the continent, why are you here, kind of thing, is really, I think it's a combination of different factors that have evolved a bit over the last few years. But at the end of the day, it starts mostly with the types of people that I want to be around. And I'm initially Russian by birth. I grew up in Russia before moving over to the UK, and I've spent most of my professional career working internationally in various different markets, partially remotely, partially in person, moving around quite a bit. But I think I never quite found the same passion and same dedication towards building something that matters as I did when I saw some specifically at that time West African entrepreneurs who were building solutions for a consumer demographic, but where those solutions in my mind had a much bigger impact than charities and non-government organizations and the development organizations had ever had with many of their kind of support Africa programs. I was quite impressed by how passionate people were, having seen perhaps what is possible in Asia, having seen some of the technological advances in North America, and then seeing the discrepancy between that and something back home, for example, in Accra or in Lagos, going ahead and saying, okay, well, transport is messed up, I'm going to fix this. Or transit of goods is messed up, I'm going to fix this. Or payments are messed up, I'm going to fix this, because no one else is seemingly solving the problem. And I found some of the most resilient founders building in these markets and supporting them overcoming some of those challenges, whether that's with financing, with advice, or just with a useful connection or two, has proven to be very, very helpful. In fact, what I do today, which is largely focused on creating more or helping more African focused investors take the first step, really came from that same realization that there are tons of people who are African VC enthusiasts, both domestically on the continent, among the diaspora, and among other African enthusiasts like myself, who often don't know how to take the first step, so they don't. But sometimes you just have to kind of put yourself on a plane, get out there, start building something, and then you realize how some of those challenges actually affect you in person, and then you can start devising a solution that's actually feasible.
Yes, that's amazing. There's a saying that often we sit around waiting essentially for the right path to stumble upon us, but we fail to realize that paths are made by walking and not by waiting. And that's something that really stands out to me, especially with what you just ended off with right there. But I want to ask you something in regards to again just investing challenges. Some would argue, and I get where they're coming from, and I understand completely. But some would argue that investing in Africa comes with challenges, right? Such as corruption, political instability, weak infrastructure. In your view, how can these challenges be addressed, and what opportunities do they present for investors?
So I see how we've evolved from a quick chat to a PhD thesis. I mean, there's a reason why you see people kicking around the geopolitical football to not let it kind of anywhere near typical company documentation when you do business in Africa, and that's because realistically those challenges are all present. There's not a single one of the 54, or depending on who you ask, 55 African markets where you're not going to face, to some extent, an issue of corruption, to some extent, an issue of political instability, and to some extent, or maybe to a larger extent, the issue of insufficient, maybe not necessarily weak, but at least insufficient infrastructure to tackle the issues. I think maybe I'll work my way back through those three. And I will caveat that as a practitioner of doing business in these markets, as an investor in these markets, and as someone who really focuses on helping investors overcome these challenges in such specific markets in Africa, I have some approaches to solving these, but these are by no means the Bible, nor by no means are they the only rules set in stone. There are many, many different solutions that are more nuanced and a heterogeneous context to each of the countries on the continent. I'll start with South Africa for a weak infrastructure example. South Africa, to many individuals that maybe have never been to Africa or don't really understand the nuances, might seem like a stalwart example of great infrastructure. Giant airports in Joburg and Cape Town, fantastic energy infrastructure, an existing set of connections with enterprise clients all over the world. And yet, a country like South Africa actually faces the biggest energy deficit in the world. The chasm between the amount of energy that's supplied by the national grid and the amount of energy that's demanded continues to grow year on year. And it's now growing at such a rate that, in fact, every community all across South Africa has measured, metered energy connections, where the government has to impose caps on when electricity is available and when it isn't. You have scheduled blackouts and things that haven't even happened, in South Africa previously, but which are now issues that trouble it today. Why do these issues exist? Well, they often exist because people play politics with infrastructure. They suggest that infrastructure funding is tied to developmental aid. Infrastructure funding is tied to a particular election season. And quite often, infrastructure in many emerging markets, this is not unique to sub-Saharan Africa at all, but really in any emerging market, is a popular, very visual promise that can be leveraged again and again whenever a new election season comes around as something that is broken but that can be improved. I mentioned I'm from Eastern Europe. It's a familiar story there. It's a familiar story in South Asia and Latin America as well. Everyone claims the roads are broken. No one actually ends up fixing them. But every election season, the roads are broken again, so more funding is necessary for our roads, our infrastructure, and our transport. Unfortunately, it's a similar issue in South Africa, and it can't easily be solved I don't think it's something that any external party can solve other than South Africans actually coming together and thinking about misallocation of resources to deploy more resources quickly towards one, buying in energy surpluses from surrounding countries, and then actually building domestic infrastructure, not reliant on debt funding or other entities, but domestic, fully South African owned, South African run infrastructure that supports a smooth energy transition to stable energy supply. Now, when we talk about political instability, obviously that varies a lot country to country. I was just speaking with a couple of friends from Kenya recently, and Kenya is a market that's quite familiar to many expats that do business in Africa. It's actually quite safe. It's a very popular tourist destination, and for most people, when they think of the country, especially if you're based in the US, you might think of safaris or Serengetis or going out there and maybe taking pictures with wild animals. But Kenya actually is quite unique in the sense that the startup, small business, and tech ecosystem has exploded over the last 10 years. It's seen some phenomenal growth that's really almost unprecedented, growing much faster than the US tech scene did in the 1950s, and the Singaporean space did in the 1970s, or that China or Russia did in the 1990s. And yet, it's plagued by political instabilities. You have various ethnic groups, they aren't always in agreement with each other. Tribalism is still a major issue when it comes to political voting and divides across the country. And unfortunately, you still have sometimes violent outbreaks. For example, I've seen several business communities that had terrorist threats, even in the center of Nairobi, an arguably relatively safe city. So it's just something that people have to adapt with and be aware of when they do business in the country. To also keep in mind that these things happen, but they aren't a make or break situation. It's not a situation where everyone lives in a safe hill in Switzerland, or they live in the middle of the desert with terrorists and bombs and no, safety anywhere. Right? There's a bit of a gray area in between, and that gray area is where pretty much every African country falls into. I think I've traveled to more than 10 different African countries to date. I've done business in a whole range of them. And I personally haven't been on the recipient end of crime, of terrorism, of any kind of kidnapping or anything to that end. So maybe BBC, CNN, and some of the other news channels need to tone it down a bit in the negative coverage, because there are great things that happen. And there's obviously a billion people plus that do business there every day. But of course, you still have to be careful. So you can't kind of overlook the fact that being stupid and not applying common sense can mean you're sometimes on the recipient end of like a crime or hostility. I think corruption is one I won't touch as much because this is arguably the hardest to solve. While political instability is really on the governments to solve, and weak infrastructure is something that requires mostly private and public partnerships, corruption is something that is unfortunately often more of a cultural thing. In many emerging markets, when a country has evolved very quickly over the course of one or two generations, something that has become the status quo often is in contrast with something that people want to have as consumers. The status quo might be a large government institution that has been used to solving issues of national security. Quite often, that has meant that that government institution has benefited from a lot of power domestically. But then the tech sector and the private sector and the growth of this whole generation of digital nomads who don't plug into the government, it kind of rides against each other. So conflict is almost inevitable. So to some extent, that conflict is almost generational. And I see many, many examples of countries all across the continent where you have young people on social media, young people, young politicians calling out perhaps a more established generation of individuals who perhaps accept corruption or assume that it's unsolvable on the basis that there is this disagreement of what is possible and what is impossible. But really, I feel like most corruption issues come from a non-acceptance of the fact that we're living in a more digitally enabled age even today than we were 5 years ago, let alone 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And many things that were perhaps previously accepted behavior because there was no solution for it are now wide in the open. People know about it. Corrupt politicians are often called out. Corrupt companies often have their documents shown online. So it's an age where there's a lot more responsibility for essentially good business behavior. And that's only going to increase over time. So not evolving with time, not at least digitizing and being more responsible going forward, even if you can't address the past, means that companies will be left behind. And when they're left behind, that's obviously going to lead to more conflict.
Oh, Hey, Mark, we may have to extend a 30-minute podcast to an hour, man. But you know what? Today, I shall spare you. So I'm not going to, because from what you just said, man, there's so much to unpack. But there's so much more to discuss. So I just want to make light on one thing, and and this is amongst the reasons why I'm in media, and you know, I continue to see the value of media, right? You said something along the lines of, the media can kind of like chill on basically the images or some of the falsehood or some of the exaggerations that they're given on Africa and how dangerous it is, and you know look out, like over caution, of whatever. Now, I recall back in, this was 2019, I was speaking with this lady, and she was in the trading space and whatnot, looking to get into, um, looking to make a transition into the e-commerce online space, what have you. But anyway, I'm having a conversation with her, and she wanted to come and visit the U.S. She was in the U.K. as well, and she wanted, because that's where you're at. You're in the UK, for those who are listening. But she wanted to come and visit the US. But and she's a woman of African descent, right? A black lady, and she said, "I'm scared. I don't want the police to just shoot me. I'm scared that when I get there, I'm going to be a victim of police brutality." And I started to laugh, like, hold on, what? And 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 that hit me hard, because the thing is, she was really serious, and obviously I wasn't a d bag about it or whatever, but just talked her through it. But she was so serious, and this is the image that she's been receiving from that side of the world, that if you're of this hue or complexion, you're just gonna get shot or killed by the police for whatever nonsensical reason. And I'm just like, nah, that's not the reality. And here we are, in this conversation. You kind of made light to that, except um, portraying Africa. And it's just so interesting how much media controls our mindset towards a region, a place, or even how we move. So I just thought I'd throw light to that. But transitioning, um, let's talk about the African market a little bit. Okay. So the African market is diverse, right? And requires a nuanced understanding of each country in the region. What strategies do you recommend for foreign investors seeking to invest um, in the emerging African market? What strategies do you recommend?
Sure. I mean, this is much closer to kind of our area of expertise, so I'm more than happy to talk on this. I'll try and be brief, though. I know we have a lot to unpack, even among some of the other talking points, and I want to give you time to quench some of your curiosities, even with the limited time that we have. But I think some of the biggest things, number one, is just assuming that you know nothing, right?
Mm,
Because sometimes knowing nothing is better than coming in with certain preconceived notions of how it is like to do business in a particular country. I know a couple of people who come to Nigeria with the expectation that everything is going to be so corrupt that they just come in with the expectation that they need to pay people. On the other hand, you have other individuals coming in to particular markets assuming that they're going to be perfectly safe. So, for example, they travel to South Africa and then they abandon common sense that you might have normally, let's say living in Brooklyn, New York, and walk around at night 1 a.m. and then they get robbed. That's not an African reality. That's just being stupid and not having any kind of common sense around you. So abandoning any preconceived notions you have is a good start when you're looking to do business in Africa, and approaching it like any other market where it's a difficult market to enter. The ease of doing business isn't there. Government support for doing business, whether that's on the startup side or the investor side, is largely non-existent. So if you're doing business, you are initially on your own. How can you supplement that? Well, you can supplement that by having a collaborative mentality.
mm,
It's a continent with 1.3 billion people, 54 different countries, several hundred different languages, and not that much that actually ties people together. Despite that, at every given opportunity, when people are given the option to, people will collaborate. I've seen a lot more prone to collaboration in East Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, and Southern Africa alike when people are actually given the opportunity to do so. So local investors, local ecosystem partners, entrepreneurship support organizations quite often are actually very keen to collaborate with international investors and don't see them as competitors. They will see them as competitors if those entities enter the market without giving them a heads up, without speaking with them, without touching base with them, and without seeking to extend a certain metaphorical olive branch to try and see what they can do together. What I've seen is quite often, especially US funds, because maybe they've become quite comfortable sitting in a market that's well capitalized, they assume that they can come into an African market and simply throw money at a solution, perhaps even paying above a certain premium, hoping that that was going to win them kind of hearts and minds. But unfortunately, that's often not the case. Relationships are built through in person interaction, and they are built from a certain degree of trust that organizations have to each other. And that trust is just never going to be there unless you take the time to actually approach things with that collaborative mentality. It's why you see a lot of, for example, Asian funds that regularly, almost every year, make trips to Africa. It's not because they have to do so, it's because they recognize, coming from cultures where quite often relationships are also sacred and hold a very important role in society, they recognize the importance of being there, sharing face, understanding things on the ground, and actually interacting with the entrepreneurs they invest in, with the investors that they work together with operators on the ground. So I think that cultural context is quite important. Now, I think when it comes to market research, a lot of international investors think that market research means let's hire an expensive consultant who gives us an 100-page report that we can say we read, we can then ignore it, and then we do things as we wanted to do anyway. That's not the way you should approach doing market research in African markets, because the biggest element of unique insights you'll find, and I think even for me, this was a cultural shock, I got like 7, 8 years ago when I first started to look at doing business in Africa, was understanding the cultural difference of what symbolism, what imagery, and what brand loyalty, for example, means in different countries. You'll find that some things bring people together. For example, talking about football in any of the soccer for the American listeners in any of the African countries is going to be a great way to get the conversation going. It bridges any language, brings people together. Everyone loves talking about sports, especially team sports. But politics, democracy, Republican ideals, or goals around any idea of, for example, geopolitical discussions often are a sensitive topic. And it's really important to kind of understand when you come into a particular country what you can or you shouldn't be discussing, because you can actually cause offense to someone even without offending their political position by just putting them into an uncomfortable situation where you're bridging the political, business, and personal discussions without the right etiquette or understanding how people actually interact. I think a good example of this that I'll give is doing business in North Africa often means that you can't bring up a business transaction in the first conversation that you have. Being a standard, typical, and perhaps American businessman and coming to the point right away, where you might think you're saving both parties their formalities, is often actually perceived as being rude and disrespectful to the locals who might have come out to actually welcome you and are genuinely curious about whether you had a good flight, what you think of the local culture and local food, right? So it doesn't pay actually well to understand and take time to do the cultural market research, whichever market you're expanding into or doing business in. I think the final point I'll make is just invest time in yourself, right? Don't always assume that somebody else is going to be doing your job for you. Many African countries have a lot of intermediaries, and not all the intermediaries are working with your best interests at heart. So, one of the best things you can do as an African focused investor is upskill yourself, right? Go online, search up African investment courses. How can I be an African investor? African venture capital, and read. It's not the case, same situation as we had 20 years ago where there were no resources online. I mean, this is obviously a great place for a shameless plug for organizations like ours, which do a step above that. We actually go ahead and train people through dedicated programs focused on working professionals or investors that want to do business in Africa, both for individuals and institutions. We have dedicated support that helps you kind of navigate the challenges of doing that. But even beyond Dream VC, there are many organizations that are specifically putting out free resources out there of what should you know, for example, if you're investing in Ethiopia. What should you know if you're investing in Burkina Faso? What should you know if you're investing in Cote d'Ivoire? And how do you do business locally without just spraying and praying your money and hoping that one of these investments are going to do well? But yeah, I think that's quite enough for that question.
Whew. Okay. No, that's No, that's solid right there. Now I want to know. Let's dive into technology, and I'm glad that you touched up on the mindset of the different regions, the U.S. Where we want to get straight to the what we'll call some will call the chicken, getting straight to the point at hand. What are we here to discuss? Bang, 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 bang. And let's go our separate ways. Especially New York is known for that, whereas California may be more relaxed, whereas the Midwest may be more relaxed. But even in the U.S., you have different regions where people are more snappy, people are more nice or more friendly and whatnot. So, what more do we expect for different continent that have these regions with all these different countries and cultures and tribes and all that stuff. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Something to definitely be cognizant about, even for the African entrepreneurs who are listening to this. On the other end of things, when you're dealing with American or investors, or even somewhat Western, but for sure American investors I could speak of, understand if they may be a little bit quick to the point and whatnot, is not a disrespectful thing. That's just how Americans are. Especially American entrepreneurs. We want to get straight to the matter of fact. What are we doing? What's the plan? What's the agenda? What are we looking to accomplish? Let's get to that. And then maybe we can talk about family life afterwards, right? So just keep that in mind for African entrepreneurs, those in the MENA looking to work with American investors. Anyway, I want to know about how can technology play a role in supporting Africa's economic growth, and what opportunities exist within the technology sector.
Okay, I think that's two questions that are quite different. So, how can it support growth, and what opportunities actually exist?
Mhm.
Well, I think the first point to me is arguably actually more interesting than the second. And that's because before I ventured into startups and the VC space, I was always quite interested more as a reader or just an enthusiast, and rather someone in an actual professional capacity of thinking about the big picture, macroeconomics, what actually happens in a 5 year time span, a 10 year time span. My background's in economics, so maybe that was just drilled into me in university. But whatever the question was, I always thought it's quite interesting when you look at, for example, Southeast Asian nations such as Singapore, such as Thailand, such as Malaysia. Many of them went through a period where a entirely agrarian country became a manufacturing hub and is now on the tech map as a hub of tech activity, digital consumption, e-commerce, digital marketplaces, and more. And that happened over the course of one or sometimes 1.5 generations, where a typical generation is about 20 years old, right? So over the course of a 30-year window, you had essentially a fourth industrial revolution happening in a whole bunch of countries. You can even look at East Asia for another example. China went through an almost entirely agrarian economy in the 1970s to a completely post industrialized economy by the 1990s to now a digitally first economy in the 21st century, right? Just one generation between each of these big jumps. Now, what's quite interesting is that some African countries are going through that same transition in less than one generation. And on one hand, that's amazing because we have this element of leapfrogging. I'm sure you must have seen this in the news. Everyone abuses that word like it's the next hot hashtag. Leapfrogging just means you're jumping between point A and point B, perhaps skipping a particular step. And that's what many countries are doing. They're skipping from no signal to 5G signal over one generation. They're skipping from poor internet to fantastic fiber optics, from having no agricultural technology to having drones irrigating farms, right? These transitions that took Europe or the US 200 years to process are sometimes happening over a 10-year window. And on the side of tech adoption and innovation and creating new jobs, that's fantastic. On the side of who's left behind, that's not as fantastic because the impact of this tech disruption is arguably much more visibly felt in many African markets where you have a enormous disconnect between how successful and how wealthy individuals can become in the tech space in an urban hub and how relatively underdeveloped individuals remain in many rural communities that don't have access to this leapfrogging, that don't have access to the same technology or the same global channels that are now plugging into African markets. So I think the biggest thing is, how can tech really help African growth? Well, it can become a key sector. In the same way as a stereotype has now pervaded our collective conscience that China and India and similar markets are hubs for all the global servers, all the global tech support, all global software development around the world. And that's only happened over the last 20, 30 years or so. I think the same is possible with many African markets. The importance of university education is often kind of beaten into society quite literally, and it's much more pervasive in many African countries. A lot more people still value university education more so than they do in European or US countries in comparison. And as a result, you have a lot of people going and becoming highly educated and potentially going into industries that are kind of forefront of industry disruption, into technology, into software development, into hardware engineering, software engineering, etc. And if that can become a major sector, then that can also change the narrative of Africa away from African countries being predominantly sources of raw materials or limited manufacturing, to African countries being a source of high quality digital knowledge sector labor. Because it's already difficult to transition African countries from agrarian economies to industrial hubs when the industrial global supply chains already predominantly are dominated by Asian markets. That's a point of competition that's very difficult to enter into, and it's difficult to compete because both parts of the world have a huge demographic factor in their advantage. But something that isn't currently serviced enough is the tech sector. The tech sector continues to explode. In some countries in the developed world, or the so-called well-capitalized world, the knowledge sector already accounts for more than 50% of global annual domestic output. But in many African countries, it's less than 5%. So until that changes, until the tech sector becomes a sector that's actually important, it's still going to sit behind oil and gas, energy, and critical infrastructure in any kind of policy making that African governments will make. And I don't fault them on that, because they're thinking about what actually contributes the most value to the economy. Until that starts to change, so until we start to see a lot more investment in tech, a lot more collaboration with tech, where tech economies start to overshadow perhaps some of these more traditional sectors, technology is still going to be something that's only talked about within a relatively small echo chamber of the same startup and tech community. As for finally your point on opportunities, well, I think that's kind of answered by the earlier point. If we can really focus in on how we can make tech a mainstream point of conversation, then that can unlock funding that previously has been maybe locked into more traditional sectors to flow into things like digitizing the transport space, digitizing the agricultural space, digitizing the safe movement of people and goods and money, which are arguably the three fundamental pillars upon which a digital society is built.
All right. So, in your experience, what would you say are the most promising sectors for investment in Africa, and what factors would you consider before investing in any sector, um, or country?
I mean, I've always said that I'm big on movement. I like to travel around myself. I like to move around. I think I've been a global citizen inadvertently before the word was even made. But movement of people, movement of goods, and movement of money, as I mentioned in the last question, I think these three things are really undervalued in a market where everything is easy. Sitting in the UK, sitting in France, sitting in Singapore and China and Hong Kong, in the US, Canada, anywhere else, it's very simple to imagine. You want to get up, you want to move from point A to point B. Okay, great. Grab your passport if you have one, get in a car, move. Take a tram, take a bus, take a plane. Many options exist, and many of them have become relatively affordable. There's a fun story actually where people often coming to Europe don't realize that I can sit in London and take a $10 plane ticket that will take me across to another country. That's how cheap air traffic flights, for example, have become in some parts of the world. At the same time, that movement of people is very much a really expensive and difficult to solve issue in many African countries. It's actually cheaper for you to fly from the US to Australia than it is for you to fly from West Africa to East Africa. simply because there's almost a complete lack of collaboration around air traffic and air flights. People can't agree on particular routes. Airlines are locked in consistent negotiation with multiple different governments about routes and timings and flights, and the logistics often simply isn't sufficient on the ground, which means that planes get delayed even though there's no traffic in the air. They get delayed because either there's an issue with the staff, there's an issue with the airport having enough fuel on hand, something else which is actually relatively easier to solve if there's a coordination of multiple different stakeholders. What I've seen is there are flights that go for $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 that are just intercountry flights in Africa, whereas a flight covering the same distance in the US might cost you a few hundred, and the same distance in Europe might cost you less than $100. So these kind of sectors where it actually affects a lot of people, and it can affect a lot of people, and it's a major hindrance to doing business, I think those sectors are quite interesting. And that kind of folds into itself logistics, transport, tourism, anything that relates to the movement of people. Movement of goods is quite important as well. At the moment, historically at least, many African countries predominantly import and export outside the continent. You might have several neighboring countries within a 100-kilometer range, but almost all of your goods are being shipped 10,000 kilometers from the US and then being shipped on another 20,000 kilometers onto China, right? That's not a very globalized way of doing business. That's just inefficient domestic trade. And that cross-border activity is increasing. So I'm always quite excited to see companies that are bridging that gap, making it easier to expand from one African country to another, making it easier to do business across borders. For example, I've seen some interesting startups that have been in the telehealth space that allow you to access the same health coverage or the same health insurance in multiple different African countries, something that was previously never possible to do and which was usually too difficult for international health insurance to tackle. Finally, I guess the elephant in the room when we talk about African tech is fintech, movement of money. You need to pay for something every day. Every day, everyone in the world thinks about what they need to pay for. Money is arguably the thing that brings most of us together. It's also the thing that causes the most amounts of argument, more so than anything else, at home, at work, or anywhere else. Unfortunately, the ease of moving money is something that still hasn't been cracked in Africa. 6 of the 7 largest private sector companies, the unicorns out there, all are focused on fintech. And I can imagine another 100 being focused on fintech without still solving the problem. Overwhelmingly, the majority of payment channels in between African countries and non-African countries, and payments for goods and services still involve a lot of red tape. And what many startups have done is they've tried to cut a few corners to make that process easier, which is a short-term solution. But it's kind of like putting a plaster on an open wound. It's not really going to heal the underlying issue, that you need to really involve, again, governments into removing any barriers and moving funds. You need to involve international channels so that banks, for example, on the continent can connect to things like SWIFT and IBAN, global banking channels, allowing bank transfer to bank transfer without having to go through 5 different intermittent entities. And you need to decrease the fees that go into, almost artificially, that go into FX differences. At the moment, it's very easy for me, being based in the US, for example, to access any currency I want. But being based in Africa, and if you want to access USD, pounds, euro, or Chinese yuan, for example, it's quite difficult because that currency often isn't in the holdings of the local central bank, and it's quite difficult to get hard cash if you need it to buy foreign produce. So making it easier to access foreign currency, making it easier for foreign and domestic currency to move around, and then making it easier for that to move around cross-border are still things that need to be solved. So all of these sectors are sectors that I'm always looking at.
Okay, now we've gone a bit over, but I think we hopefully we'll have enough time for this last question here. Thank you. Please bear patience with us. But I honestly, man, as you speak, my mind is just going on a roller coaster, and I'm just thinking through a ton of things. And I'm like, golly, if I were to ask these questions, we'd probably be here for 4 or 5 hours recording, and that would just be for a portion of the questions that I have. So, uh, with that being said, I'm super excited to have you back because I know there's still so much to uncover, so much happening in the ecosystem in the continent. So, but with that being said, let me ask you this final question here. What advice would you give to investors are considering investing in Africa, and what push factors would you recommend um, governments in the region to incentivize investments?
Sure. Again, two big questions that I'll just have to narrow down. I'll try and keep it short because I know we're already a bit over. But I think the biggest thing for investors is, again, educate yourself. Please educate yourself. How you educate yourself is obviously not in my control, but whether it's through online programs that specifically target a key aspect of knowledge you don't have, whether it's through conversations you have with businesses that are actively day to day doing business in Africa, whether it's by taking multiple trips, just being on the ground, working through a market, speaking to individual business owners, speaking to locals who actually have been there for 20, 50, 60 years and who understand some of the challenges they're facing, it's so important because we've seen a bunch of startups get funding over the last 5 or 6 years where this funding would have never come to Africa otherwise. So it's great that they're funding these businesses, but some of these businesses are completely disconnected from actual local issues. Someone building a last mile logistics solution when last mile logistics is already present. Someone building a e-mobility solution when you have several major e-mobility solutions that already exist and that are cheaper. Someone trying to build an education solution without actually thinking about whether the education space in this country is private or public or both, right? That certain disconnect, it's almost laziness. And that laziness is usually not existent among the local investment space because they've understood that. They've experienced that market. They've been there before. But I see that a lot among some international investors who seem to just assume that because things are cheaper in Africa, you don't need to spend the time to understand how to do business. But those challenges are real and they can really damage your investment. So I really hope that people take the time to educate themselves. What was the second question?
Man, I think you answered it all, but essentially what I was wondering is what the advice that you would have for investors, and what push factors would you recommend governments in the region
Yes, yes. I
incentivize
mean,
investment?
honestly, for governments, I don't want to be too political here, but I would say look at Tunisia and try and copy that. Because while Tunisia is not a top tier startup ecosystem today, what they have done in terms of bringing forward, bringing across the chamber, and actually passing in terms of policies, specific dedicated government directives to support startups and investors alike, is the closest among any African countries that I've seen an African country come to providing the level of startup and investor friendly policies that the US or Singapore or Europe has. Policies that enable investors not to pay taxes if they're backing innovative domestic ventures. Policies that remove the tax threshold on new businesses as they go through the first critical few years when they're really scraping to get their first customers. Policies that defer, for example, regulatory obligations. If you're a startup that's just building out, you don't want to find out a week into building your idea, which you've committed your own money and attention and love into, that the government's going to slap you with a requirement to put $200,000 into getting a license to do what you want to do, especially when you're solving a tangible problem that will not be solved if you're not solving it, right? So there needs to be a bit more of understanding from a government side of what investors want, which is obviously quite often ease of getting your money into this ecosystem, and what startups want, which is the ease of being able to build, get set up, and get established in this ecosystem. And there's many different policies that you can pass to enable that, ranging from the ones that I've mentioned to, for example, tax incentives for fund managers that set up on the ground, cheaper access to accounting services, or, for example, consultancy services to international businesses that move to do business in Africa, or even just access to government finances that might be already set aside for innovation funding, but which normally gets locked up into existing private equity firms or into broad initiatives without a tangible KPI. Instead, setting aside some of that money and saying, okay, as a government entity, we're going to invest in our own startups. And that's going to prove to international investors that we care about what's happening in our space. What's quite shocking is in most African countries, the sovereign funds, the government funds, that are supposed to be giving money to local PE funds and local VC funds predominantly often hold their money abroad. So when they are actually putting their money into private equity or venture capital, it's going to international investors rather than domestic ones. And that's a simple policy directive change. Tell pension funds to start putting aside at least 5% of your money into local funds. That's going to create local fund managers who will invest in local companies. And that's going to attract international investors to come in and follow on. And so that can build a much more thriving and much more domestically driven, successful startup ecosystem in any African country. And Tunisia is making some really great steps towards that. So is Kenya, so is Nigeria, and a couple of other countries like the Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire are also far along in passing startup friendly policies. So I'm excited to see how this will evolve. But for any policymakers listening into the conversation, you have your homework. Go out there and start working.
Wow. Wow, Mark. Whew. This I hope you know that this EP here is going to be very timeless. So I hope you're aware of that, and just a wealth of knowledge, wisdom that you've shared with us here, and this is why I'm excited to record multiple episodes with you. And again, this is the Hue Seth Show. I'm your host, Hue Seth, and this episode is powered by the Africa Chamber of Digital Commerce. Joining us today is Mark Kleyner of Dream VC, founder of Dream VC. It's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. Catch you later.